Hey everyone, it's Canadian Libertarian, getting ready to do an interview with a fellow Canadian, a fellow liberty lover, someone who cares tremendously, like I do, about individual rights and freedoms in Canada. And we're trying to bring things, instead of dealing with, as a lot of you already know, you turn your television dial or you flick through your channels or whatever you do. If you are paying attention to those in the establishment media, nothing you hear has anything to do with philosophical truths, objective reason, logic. It's all team A against team B, right? Left versus right. It's all divide and conquer, oppressor versus the oppressed. Whereas people like me and Frank, we want to actually educate and enlighten people properly. Not tell you what to think, but at least to think. You have to think. You have to be objective. You have to be able to listen and discern what's truth and what's fictional, what's fact and what's just built on the concept of lies and mysticism. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be hammering out. We're going to be talking about subjects that, we'll be dealing with the political realm, but at the same time, because we recognize that the political realm is an area that does exist, well, we have to function within that realm as well. And what we're going to be touched down on initially is the Ontario PC leadership race, because Kathleen Wynne and her ilk, and McGinty before her, they've been spending the last decade and a half at least destroying, and I mean, I grew up for many years in Ontario, and it's an amazing province with a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people with business zeal, and people that just want to create and innovate and produce things that we all enjoy. But as we've seen, every time there's a flourishment of economic activity, well, you can always count on the parasitical class, the people that want to take over and collectivize the fruits of those labors, of those efforts. And what we're seeing today is, capitalists are pretty good as far as allowing these socialists, these communists, these collectivists to take and assume portions of their productive income, their wealth, and their innovation. What we're seeing today, though, is when you get too far, when you push the goalpost too far in one direction, where you have socialism trying to overtake the capitalists, well, that's usually the time, that's usually when the warning signs are flashing that your economy and your society, as an ultimate outcome of the breakdown of your economy, will have devastating and negative effects. It's not just consequential for a day or a week or a month or a year, but it affects the psychology, the economy, and the social habits and behaviors of millions of people. So what we're looking at today when we're talking about the leadership race is who is going to be able to take over the helm. Now, I'm not recognizing the fact that, I'm not even suggesting the fact that we need political intervention in the economy. As far as I'm concerned, there should be no intervention when it comes to politics in the economy. But because there is such a thing, and because we do live in Canada, aka Canuckistan as I call it sometimes, we do have this collectivization. So the pushback has to be, and it has to come from those who understand the private sector, who understand business. And you know what? As far as the leadership candidates, Doug Ford seems to have that in spades, and in addition to that, has the capacity and the willingness to be bold and stand in opposition to those who want to forcefully redistribute the income and the wealth that's produced by those who create and innovate. But anyways, I'm going to pass it off now to Frank Vaughan. He has his own podcast. I recommend that you do go to frankvaughan.ca.
Well, thank you, Bennett, because this conversation's been a long time coming, because I follow your channel and I've seen you grow. And, specifically when it comes to Ontario politics, it has been a quagmire and a black morass, like you say, for at least 10 or 15 years. We have been going further and further down the socialist hole, where the collectivists are basically taking more and more of the economy and siphoning more and more of the income off, and they're not even balancing the books. They're burdening future generations with an enormous amount of debt, with ever-increasing deficits, and we're getting less and less and less return on our investment as taxpayers. So when it comes to where we are versus where we would like to go, in our preliminary conversation last night, we were talking about the fact that, we all have an ideal vision of what society should look like, or what government's role is, if there's a role for government. And the fact is, we're so far down the governance rabbit hole that we have to take practical and pragmatic steps back from the precipice. And that means finding and identifying political candidates that will get us closer to our goals. And before this leadership election that's going on right now, we had basically Kathleen Wynne, I believe it's Horwath in the NDP, and Patrick Brown leading the PC party. And that guy was that guy was a non-choice. He basically he crafted this document called the People's Guarantee, which was anything but the People's Guarantee. It had nothing to do with the people. It excluded 80-odd% of the grassroots of the party. And he came out basically with a platform that was identical to the Kathleen Wynne platform on all important planks: carbon taxes, wind turbines, no mention of deficits, no mention of debts, and he oversaw a corrupt political process which saw his friends and his backers parachuted into nominations, including Caroline Mulroney, and ballot box stuffing and corruption that was incredible. So I was looking anywhere else. I was looking at Trillium. I was looking at the Ontario Libertarian Party. I was looking anywhere else for something to do, something productive that would get us closer to our goals. And then the whole thing with Brown fell apart. And all of a sudden, Doug Ford enters the race. And also, I gotta give a shout out to Tawny Granick-Allen, because she wouldn't have been allowed to run under Patrick Brown. And as soon as he dropped out, she jumped in at the opportunity to just raise awareness about the corruption in the PC party. And so now we actually have a candidate in Doug Ford, and also an attack dog almost that could work with him in government to get us taking steps away from total governance and back towards balanced budgets, less deficit, and more individual freedom. A businessman. I mean, the guy's a successful businessman in the industry of printing, and I don't know how much you know about printing. I know a few things about it. It's a dying industry. How you can still be successful in printing it's an amazing thing in itself. So that's the introduction of my thoughts.
No, but you know what you said when you were talking about this People's Guarantee. I agree, and what I seen and recognized was just not too long ago, a couple of years ago now, when there was a few years ago, when there was another challenge to the Liberals, Ontario Liberals, came from Tim Hudak. And what I recognized instinctively, and this is the problem that I see that's so embedded, so entrenched, that I have to admit it's vastly difficult, but I basically, what I see this guarantee, what you're suggesting is, that's like basically virtue signaling to those, and there's a substantial portion of the population in Ontario that have now amalgamated and congregated to being basically obedient serfs, subjects, and slaves to the ruling class, to the government. So they recognize they have to keep that system sustained to a certain degree, to a certain aspect, to appease a substantial portion of the population. Now, I don't know the numbers exactly in Ontario, but in Canada overall, with a country that's only 36 million people, the population of that 36 million that are gainfully employed through the public sector, so whether it's federal, provincial, or local, is now at 4.1 million. So you're talking substantial, like you're talking 1 in 10, 11 people in Canada that is now, and then if you broad base or take that out to, let's say you're employed by the government, well, your spouse, your children, these are people that are relying on that income as well. So we've gotten ourselves to the point where this, like I say, this forced subjugation, this collectivism, is so many people, and this is what socialism does, becomes reliant on that central planning model, that it becomes almost impossible to push back. And we've seen that when Tim Hudak was running, he said, I'm going to eliminate 100,000 public sector jobs. Now, as far as even common sense, the utilitarian aspect, or even moral, of course that should be the case, because we live in the information age. Education is a perfect example where, why the hell are we paying? And I have nothing against teachers, right? But in a proper competitive model, the ones that are truly teaching should be able to do so. But why are they stuck with having to teach 30 people in one class while maybe 20 of their peers get paid the same amount and basically aren't even holding up their end of the bargain and actually properly educating their children? When reality says you could have a situation, and we're seeing this now, like people like Jordan Peterson, where they're saying we could have like online universities. These people are putting some of the greatest minds on the planet are putting that information out there, and then it's basically not free, but it's so minute in cost. It's easily distributed. And it's just basically the cost of your broadband, of your internet connection. Right, exactly. And like I say, I'm not the kind of person, I'm pragmatic just like you. I'm not saying we're going to throw all the teachers kick them all to the curb. But hello, like, you know, we see the budgets, right? The budgets, well, Ontario is the most indebted sub-sovereign on the entire fucking planet. On the entire planet, people. I mean, think about what that means on the whole planet. California is almost a basket case on its own, but they're only indebted to the tune of half of what Ontario is, and Ontario is a province that has a population that's much, much smaller. Well, California has a population that's exceeding the entire population of Canada. So why are we spending all this money and enslaving future generations with these debt obligations? Like you say, what are they? I forget the number I last heard. I think it's around how many billions of dollars are going just towards interest payments. For what? To keep up a pretense, or that we have to keep all these people gainfully employed in the public sector. But when you look in the private sector, this is the despairing part that really disturbs me. The people that produce all the wealth and the income are in the private sector. The government basically just redistributes that wealth and that income. But the people in the private sector, we've had to deal with, especially men in particular, but women as well. We've had to deal with all these interruptions and disruptions in the economy where we've had to maybe retrain ourselves, maybe go do jobs of lesser pay. But you know what? Because we function in the private sector, we have to figure out ways how to navigate, right? And it makes us more creative. It actually makes us more entrepreneurial. We have the ambition, we have the resolve to do so. The people in the private sector or the public sector have become so complacent that they believe that no matter how inefficient, right? And that's the thing when you take away the you take away the economic modeling from any equation, where you can just enslave future generations. That's what fiat currencies does nowadays, and with these long-term bonds, is now you can just offload all your bad investments, all your costs, all your expenditures onto future generations. Whereas, you know, just think of in a family. Yeah, you might be able to, if you had like a credit card and someone kept giving you an increased limit on it, you could keep running that up and spending it recklessly, but yet at some point you would realize that, wait a minute, I'll never be able to pay it off, and who's going to be ultimately on the hook? Well, actually in the private sector, your children can never be forcefully put on the hooks for your debt obligations, whereas in the private sector, they can do, or in the public sector, they can do that. And that's the thing that I find most disturbing is, of course, we're not trying to throw teachers out of their positions or occupations, but if that's what is the pretense of how we create and innovate and make things more seamlessly available to people. That's ultimately, if you care about the education of the young people, then being able to educate millions of people with a much smaller pool of entitled public servants, well, that's a net benefit. That's a net gain. That's a positive thing for anyone in the private sector. So that money that you could be saving that's going to these, you know, teachers that are just basically placeholders for the most part, because they're not, a lot of them, as we're seeing, like, look at the students, look at all the stats, even Stat Canada, it shows you, what is it, 18% of women, 22% of men are actually economically or financially literate. So that means 3/4 to 4/5 of the population are coming out of these schools and not even properly educated. So what are we getting? What are we benefiting from?
That's just it. The cost keeps going up, and the results keep going down. We can see it in test scores. We can see it in especially in Ontario. The test scores, especially math, keeps going down, 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 and the cost keeps going up. And it's interesting, going back to your point about public sector workers, in Ontario, the number's 40%. That in some way, shape, or form, 40% of the province is dependent on government in some way, shape, or form for its income. And I find it deeply disturbing that 40-odd% of the PC party was willing to vote for Patrick Brown again after he re-entered the leadership race, in spite of all his corruption. What that tells me is the people's moral compass, or the people's ability to absorb information and actually think about it constructively and critically, is at an all-time low. And that's where we're at. Like, we're talking about the issue of our times. We've got to get back control of the public sector, and we need to create we need to incentivize the public sector so it's more results oriented, so that people actually have to improve their skill sets, people actually have to deliver results in an economically feasible way, or they lose their jobs. And because in the private sector, as you noted, if you screw up, if you're an entrepreneur like myself and your product sucks and you can't sell it, that means you go broke and you lose your home. So that's your incentive right there to improve. And I mean, you're not just competing in terms of product. You got to pay taxes, you got to go through regulations, you got to do all this stuff to maintain your competitive edge and make sure that you're profitable. People have to voluntarily part with their money to support you in whatever endeavor it is you're doing. That's huge. That means that you're constantly incentivized to get better. Where is that in the public sector? I deal with a doctor right now. I'm actually changing doctors because the doctor I had is so god-awfully terrible. You go in there, you're trying to get something done, he ships you off to one office to another office. 2-3 months later, you finally get some kind of result. Like, it takes 3 weeks to get in to see this guy. And then it's 2 months of getting you shift around. He doesn't even look you in the eyes. He doesn't lift his head from the laptop. And then you get all the stuff he wants. I had a knee problem. And he says, I'm going to set you up with a specialist appointment. 6 months goes by, I don't hear from the specialist. I call the office back. His secretary bites my head off, saying, oh, you got to wait. It's been 2 years. I solved the knee problem myself in the private sector. That's how I did it. So I mean, and what's my recourse? I can complain to the Ontario College of Physicians and nothing will happen because nothing ever happens. This guy is still practicing and there's absolutely no recourse. That's one example. I could give you numerous ones, and I'm not just saying that. I actually could. Whereas if you're a chiropractor or you're an acupuncture therapist or you're operating in an alternative clinic and you don't deliver results, people won't give you money. And that's it. Now we have to bring some of that into the public sector, in my opinion. I mean, why would people who care about their jobs and who care about children, who care about their patients, why would they be afraid of having some sort of performance litmus test to determine if they're worth the money?
Exactly. Bureaucracy, socialism, communism, collectivism, the pretense that you have some, I don't know, right or privilege that you should be part of some collective ruling class that, I don't know, it's just, to me, it's so religious, so cult-like in nature. But
that you're entitled to your job.
Right.
Entitled to it. You don't have to earn it. It's just yours by default.
Exactly. And that's such a destruction to, and we all know, like, whether you break it down, psychological, biological, politics, philosophy, humans function off of incentive. I mean, there's lots of people that can give you political narratives, right? And even can quote philosophers of the past, but ultimately every one of them would have to acknowledge that humans, we all function based on incentives. And what happens when you're living under the socialist or the forced income or wealth redistribution model is like you say, there's no incentive for you to hold yourself to any particular standard because you have multiple layers and redundant layers of bureaucracy that will maintain the fact that you're going to get a paycheck whether you're productive or creative or innovative or actually educating and informing people, and that's just the education system. But there's so many other areas in the economy where, like you've seen, a perfect example I've used in the past is when you go to places that are unionized, or places that everyone's employed through mandated minimum wages. You will look at, I mean, just if you're a fly on a wall in any corporation, any business, or in the education sector, or anywhere else, you'll see that they're not all created equal. That's a false pretense. You'll see that there's probably, and studies have shown that it might even be just 10% of people in a particular field that are creating 50% of the actual growth of their particular model. So whether it's education or economic activity. So you have a minority of people that are producing half of the goods or the services, and then everyone else gets to get paid in the same manner, at the same level, and compensated to the same degree as those that are working maybe or functioning at a level that maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 times more than that. Where does that work? That's like, imagine yourself in any venture, like people like to talk about the Olympics. Could you imagine lining up a race between a bunch of sprinters where the fastest guy is set way back here, and then the slowest person is set up so that when you get to the end of the race, everybody's supposed to get to the finish line at the same time.
Equal outcome instead of equality of opportunity.
Right. And so you've destroyed that person that has made it their life effort, their goal to be better than someone else, to offer something, whether it's a product, a service, or whatever they've got to offer. They want to exceed that. And that's basically that exceeding other people's expectations or thinking outside the box is literally, not figuratively, literally the very basis of all the amenities, all the beautiful things that we all get to enjoy, whether it's the internet, whether it's, all the things that we get to. We live today, even in spite of all the forced wealth and income redistribution, because the productive people are so productive, we live, is even just people in the lower class, better than kings and queens of old world Europe or in the past. But the problem that we're seeing today is people are naturally, or most people are naturally generous, right? If they can, provide for themselves, keep a roof over their heads, stay in their family, and do all those things, most people don't even mind. This is the thing that drives me crazy, is most people don't even mind being robbed on a continual, ongoing basis. But with people that are in government, because of that incentive, the destruction of incentive, they look out there and they see, oh, well, people seem to be willing, they seem to be complacent, so let's push that goalpost further and further. But once again, the unknown is what we don't see. So how much of that creativity, how much of that innovation, how much faster would our economies be growing if it wasn't for that destructive nature of collectivism, of destroying incentives? Who knows, we might already be, people say, like, you got your Elon Musk out there, but there might be 20, 30, 50 Elon Musk if it wasn't for the fact that it takes and requires someone that has, almost a Herculean amount of strength to go against that. Although I'll even recognize myself, people like Elon Musk, they almost feel like they're compelled to have to work with government. So yeah, it's incentive. To me, it's incentive. Stop destroying people's natural incentives.
Yeah, and I mean, you brought up a good point with unions, or at least some unions, and bureaucracies. Government's not the only spawning ground of bureaucracy. It comes from all sorts of places. And the problem with bureaucracies is they always seek to preserve themselves and stay the same. They're totally opposed to change. An example of a private sector bureaucracy is the banking system. When was the last substantive improvement to the speed at which you can transfer money between countries and geographic locations? It hasn't happened. You're still going to the same ATM that was introduced 30 years ago. And that's given rise to another private sector solution, which is blockchain, which is a whole other, it's a whole other ball game. The more I came to understand it, the more I came to understand that it actually is an incredible tool, especially if I want to send Bennett, if I want to send you money, I can do that instantaneously. I don't have to go through a bank. I don't have to pay transaction fees. But like, the banking system totally opposes change. They oppose any competition. So it's a tightly regulated industry integrated with the government, and it functions like a bureaucracy, a very top-heavy, very profitable bureaucracy. And as long as they don't have competition, they don't ever have to change. And it's the same in government, whether it's delivery of education or healthcare or whatever. The evolution is very slow. And one of the things I liked about Doug Ford talking about the election is talking about, rather than having administrators that are parachuted in who maybe have no experience in healthcare, actually talking to those people who are motivated and performing well and saying, hey, how can we improve service delivery through your eyes and your experience? What do you see as a frontline worker that could deliver efficiencies for the taxpayer and actually end up with better care? So that's where the private sector always has an impetus towards incentivizing change. Like my business itself, I can distinctly pinpoint 3 specific evolutionary changes in the development of my business. And I can tell you that today, the business we operate looks absolutely nothing like the business that got started 15 years ago. Nothing is the same. It's totally different. And we responded to our clients. We responded to what people were willing to buy and what we wanted to do. And at some point in our life, the job became too difficult in some ways, and so we just altered the job and we measured cash flow and we said, okay, this is working, and we moved. Where is that incentive for a bureaucracy? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because the taxpayer is a cash cow that can constantly be milked for more and more money. It doesn't matter what slush fund the government wants to set up. If they overspend, they can either borrow in our names or they can tax us more and then just give more money away. We are not empowering Ontario's best. We're not empowering Canada's best They're in the private sector, or they've already left the country, or they're doing other things. What we do is we take money from the taxpayer and we give it to people who aren't really that worthy of it. Look at the Phoenix pay fiasco at the federal government. They can't even pay their own employees properly. It's insane.
Yeah, no, I agree. And when you talk about, especially like the two fields, of course, and this is stuff like you say that Doug Ford and Tanya, they're all talking about as well. And this is like I say, just let market competition. And when people say, this is kind of what bothers me, because I'm a Canadian. I've been a Canadian my whole life. I come from a whole long line of Canadians. We've been here since it was called Canada. But what bothers me the most is when you hear people say that if you're against, you know, socialist health care or a socialist education system, that you're somehow malevolent and, oh, you just don't care about people. Actually, my whole thing, and that's the beautiful part of being Canadian, is we do have our neighbors to the south. You know, they're very much more all about, well, at least they used to be. They're kind of getting twisted and distorted too, as far as their economics and their social policies, but rewarding things based on merit. So as far as I'm concerned, listen, those amazing teachers out there, and I've had a couple of them, you know, growing up, I had some great teachers, or anyone else in any other segment of the economy. Health providers, I mean, my goodness, there's teachers, or I mean, there's doctors, there's nurses, there's those people even that just, you know, maybe change your bedpan. I love each and every one of those people, because without those people, like I say, when we're in our most vulnerable points in our life, I want to reward them as best as I possibly can. And how you do that is to reward them based on their merit, based on what they're providing, right? So it's not that I'm against socialized health care because I just don't want people to be protected or have a safety net. Listen, I've said in past videos, I don't think you'd find a Canadian alive that wouldn't say, listen, I'll voluntarily, no force, no coercion, no forced wealth redistribution, no forced subjugation, I'll voluntarily cut 10% of my paycheck every pay. I will voluntarily donate 10%. Just like when I was growing up and people that go to church, right? I'll voluntarily help to provide for those that really need it, right? But by me doing it voluntarily, and where that interaction does come through the voluntary exchange and means, well, we can all hold each other to account in some aspect, in some regard. But once you put that into the hands of government, where it's just constant forced wealth redistribution, what we see today is now where we're at, and this is just plain facts, folks. If you want to look at the Fraser Institute studies, in Canada, the average person, this is average, so not necessarily the high or the low, but this is just averaged out across all Canadian people that are of the age where you're at least a productive member of society. Your incomes, now the government has taken more of your productive income, stealing from you, more than what you spend on your housing, like the roof over your head, the food in your belly, and the clothes on your back. And those, now when people want to talk about necessities, those are the necessities of life. A roof over your head, clothes on your back, and food in your belly. That's what you need to sustain yourself as a human being. When the government is taking in excess of that from you, without your permission, just by mandate, by edict, by government legislation, well, obviously it's changing and affecting the psychology, but it's destroying the incentive structure too, because you'll see out there where a lot of people today are unwilling to help people as far as charities. But I understand why people are less charitable, because yeah, they've already been plundered. Half of their income's already been plundered. Now, if people could use their charity for what they deemed it's worthy, right? So I deem a person that truly is in need, I deem them worthy. Someone that needs a surgery or they might die, I deem them worthy. But when you put that in the hands of a bureaucratic state, well, you're no longer function where we can deal with each other in the proper incentive mechanism, where now a lot of that is happening where the bureaucrats, I mean, you're taking people that are, you know, maybe making 70, 80 grand a year, take home, plus a golden parachute pension, while they're maybe 10, 20% of that is going towards where the poor people, that money, the money was originally intended, right? So if it was to help the homeless, well, a small portion of that's going to help the homeless, whereas a large portion of that is going to create a bureaucracy, multiple layers of bureaucracy, yeah, and the administrators. I don't want to help listen, nothing that I got against people that want to help people, but if you want to help people, taking your 70, 80 or grand paycheck, you know, maybe you should instead If you truly are benevolent, well, maybe you should volunteer a little bit of your time. If you're that kind of person, because that's another thing that I want to bring into the equation too. When I was growing up, they were called public servants, right? That was a public, and a public servant meant you were willing to sacrifice the benefits that you would gain economically in the private sector because you were benevolent. You had a pretense, just like people in, like I say, in the religious communities. They could do things in the private sector in an economic model that they would create more wealth and benefits for themselves. But because they have a compassionate heart, a compassionate mind, they said, okay, I'm willing to forego my economic prosperity, to a exceptional level. I'm willing to forego that so that I can help other people. Well, these people in government, where's this happening? None of them are doing it. They're making more than their counterparts in the private sector. And it's those in the private sector that are providing the incomes of those in the public sector. So, like I say, this is just, it's so destructive. People like me and Frank, we care about people too. I don't want to hear one person, and when anyone has ever charged me of this, I will fight back and I retaliate every time. Don't ever charge me with being someone that don't care about others, because I care tremendously about others. Now, I have to come first. My family comes first, but like I said, I'd be more than willing to happily provide a small portion of my productive income to help those who are desperately in need. And who wouldn't? And that 10% would actually be plenty enough. It would be plenty enough to help the ones that are truly in need.
Well, it's interesting, to back it up to where you were talking about socialized and government medicine in Canada. Maybe people would feel a little bit better about it if they were getting a bigger value for their dollar, or it was set up a little bit differently. What I try to tell people who are unquestioningly supportive of socialized medicine in Canada, which, by the way, you and I both know it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But in every other Western country that has socialized medicine, it exists in some way, shape, or form alongside a private economy in medicine. And in some places, Quebec, Maxime Bernier actually educated me on a hospital that was built in Quebec. It was under the single-payer system, but it was run like a private clinic. They still got paid by the government, but they had incentives. They paid people differently and whatever. And it became, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it became the most successful hospital in Quebec, and they shut it down. The government came in and they shut it down because it was showing them to be so wildly inefficient. And if we had some kind of private sector situation where we could voluntarily go and get I think the word's allopathic care, where we could get the kind of care that we get in a hospital, not chiropractors, not acupuncturists. We could get, our doctors, we could go pay them directly and get some kind of tax credit for that. It might incentivize the public system to, and when I say that, I'm not talking about nurses and a lot of the doctors and whatever. I'm talking about the administrators. I think the rate is something like 7 or 11 of them per hospital bed that we're paying these administrators. Like the top-heavy bloat is incredible. It's off the charts. What's going on? Someone needs to sort that out. But only in Canada, alone in the Western countries, is it illegal to purchase health insurance that competes with, in Ontario, it's called OHIP, the Ontario Health Insurance Program. You can't buy alternate health insurance. You have to have Ontario health insurance. You're not allowed to pursue private care in any way that competes with OHIP inside the province. That doesn't happen. As far as I know, the last time I checked, it doesn't happen anywhere in Europe. So why is Canada so protective? And again, it comes back to protection of the bureaucracy. It's always about preserving the status quo for the bureaucracy. God forbid we have change. God forbid we have competition. God forbid we actually have to incentivize and perform better. God forbid the administrators actually have to produce something that warrants their place on the sunshine list. I mean, look at Christine Elliott. I read something this morning. Christine Elliott, she's running for the Ontario PC leadership as well. She accepted a job with the Kathleen Wynne government where she was being paid $220,000 a year. She was an ombudsman, a health ombudsman. I can't remember the official title. She, in her tenure, 1,400 plus complaints were leveled against the health ministry in Ontario, and she investigated 2 of them. That's it. That's it. What the hell? I mean, I can't even come up with the percentage. How low a percentage of turnover that is in terms of productivity. What is going on with that? So this is the thing. I am a firm believer, and this is where I get in trouble with people, and I don't even care. We have to have some sort of private system that exists alongside the public system. Because for one thing, it would take out some of that backlog. It would give people an alternative instead of waiting 3 or 4 months maybe for the care that you need today. Because like myself, if I hurt myself, like say I break my back or I break my arm or whatever, I get cancer, God, whatever happens, if I'm stuck waiting for care for 6 months, say for a knee, and I can't work, I'm out of my home. And they make it so you have to leave the country to get private care. I know so many people myself personally who are alive today because they left the country. People I knew who got told, go home and die. They're gone now, but go home and die. You're palliative. They left the country and they're alive today because they pursued alternative treatments because the government said, go home and die. You're incurable, and they went somewhere else and got cured. Or even more simply, I know a man who had he had bone spurs in his back and his spinal column. He's in and out of doctors for a year. He's self-employed too. He lost a fortune trying to fix himself. He went to the United States. He stayed one night in a hotel. 2 days of care, MRI, everything else, $1,100 sum total. He actually won it back at the casino on the way home, and he had a diagnosis that helped him fix his problem. He's back in Canada with his American-bought diagnosis, working with doctors here through private clinics, like private chiropractic clinics, with the information he brought back, and he is getting better. That kind of failure cannot stand, and it is the norm in Canada. And even in, like I just to finish off on that point, in other Western democracies that have socialized medicine, it wouldn't stand because they have private alongside public, and they also have performance incentives, which isn't to say they won't fall apart. But I mean, Canada pragmatically could go we could take some firm steps to ensure that we're getting the best value for our dollars. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, when you talk about that, it just takes me right back to the whole competition modeling when it comes to anything that we undertake as human beings. And I've yet to hear anyone, I've heard lots of people put forth lots of political arguments and narratives and dialogues, but I've never heard anyone actually deny, and I challenge people all the time on this, is show me anywhere where there's competition, right? So rather than a one-size-fits-all, show me anywhere in your social lives or in your economic lives where there wasn't competition or your ability to have a choice where that didn't elevate each other to a substantial degree. That doesn't, and I'm not talking about sports. Sports is an easy one to point to, but like I say, any economic or social endeavor, when there's competing models, and it has nothing to do with force. Like I say, even what I love to say all the time, especially people that promote socialism or communism, it's like, hey, listen, this is the beautiful thing, is the people that are against capitalism, it's like, here's the beautiful thing about a capitalist, or a free market, I should say free market, not state capitalism. Free market capitalism says, hey, if you think your socialist model is going to work, go right ahead. I'm not going to stop you. You go ahead and try your socialist model. You are free to do so as long as you don't get forced. If everyone enters into your socialist model voluntarily, if you can make that work, then people will automatically gravitate to that model because they'll recognize that it's superior in some way. That's never actually happened. Usually what happens is when people have choice, the people that are entrepreneurial, the people that aren't using that forced or income redistribution, they have the proper and natural incentive to try to offer a better product, a better service, because that's the only way that they can lure you. Without using the gun in the room, the only way someone in the private sector, in the private market, can get you to want to use their product or service is to make sure it's superior to their competition. It's at either or at a lower price, or the combination of both. Whereas socialists, it's just a matter of, well, like I say, it's using the gun in the room. And then people always use the argument after the fact is, okay, if I went up and robbed someone, let's say I needed a surgery, right, and it cost $5,000. If I go rob from a bunch of people and it pays for my surgery, I can make an argument that says, look, I benefited from it. But you're using just the pure utilitarian argument without taking morality. And if you remove morality, whether you're talking about social or economic endeavors or politics, right? People that want to impose their mandates, edicts on others, if there isn't a moral element entered into that equation, which, well, we know already, government is already denying the morality because everything's done through force, through coercion. But without, when you remove that gun in the room, it allows those proper incentives, and those that want to create and innovate and provide products or services to any, whether it's a small community or a province or a country or on the global stage, people will gravitate to it. There are natural monopolies all over the place. Now, some of these monopolies do eventually turn to keep their monopolies and sustain their monopolies. They might very well turn to the government, the big gigantic gun in the room, to do so. But a lot of these natural monopolies happen just as a result of offering a better product or service. So in the healthcare, a perfect example would be if there was private sector healthcare and providers. People think, oh, that would only be good for the rich. But no, trust me, people are very creative and very innovative. If someone can figure out where they can cater to the people on the lower end of the pay scale or the income scale, if they can provide a service to them as well without, being too tremendously expensive or requiring too much of their productive incomes to pay it off, people will come up with the ideas. I mean, look at all the disruptors, whether it's Uber, Lyft. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on and on about people that come up, and because we have access to modern technologies, the internet, robotics, artificial intelligence, there's no longer an excuse. You could make an excuse for socialism like in the 20th century, which they did, but we see how that panned out. It was devastatingly destructive and caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. But we don't live in those days anymore. We have to function in the world we live in today. And the function in the world we live in today, thanks to the age of information, basically what I've coined the Enlightenment era 2.0, we don't have to rely on just the Gutenberg press. My God, we have the Gutenberg press on steroids, which is called the internet. So the internet is not just a matter for communication. It can also be used, like I said, if I was someone that wanted to become a doctor or a teacher, I could take my chances and roll the dice in the public sector, right? And hope, and just hope and hope and hope that the massive amount of money that I had to pay for my tuition, hope that I got a teacher that was really super proficient in their job. But because the incentive is destroyed there, I don't know, I might be being taught by someone that's somewhat incompetent. Whereas with the internet, I have access today to the philosophical teachings of people from thousands of years ago, to the most innovative creators and greatest minds of today. So I have access to many competing models. And that's the thing about the internet, is it's literally the last place on earth that is, it's almost like the wild, wild west of the past, where creativity and innovation, it still flourishes, but we're seeing time and time again that they're trying to slowly strangle and restrict our ability to even do so online. And once we get to that point, folks, if we ever allow that to happen, then it's going to set humanity's goal, which is to bring about individual freedom and prosperity for everyone. It's going to set us back decades, maybe hundreds of years, if they get to take over the internet. Let's at the very least make sure that we keep the internet open and free, so that people can use this amazing capacity, this amazing capability to create competitive models that we see time and time again. Well, Elon Musk, another example with SpaceX. What used to be destroyed, we used to spend tens and hundreds of millions of dollars on those rocket boosters, right, to send up the space shuttle. And they would get sent in and land in the ocean, dropped down to the bottom of the ocean, and destroyed on re-entry. And that was money that was squandered. Today, through using innovation, creativity, and the private sector, now we have people like Elon Musk that are creating these jet engines and these boosters that now can come back and are reusable. So
wasn't that beautiful?
Yeah, let market. Oh, I love it. I love watching that stuff.
I shed a tear. I don't even mind. I don't mind admitting.
Yeah, no, I love it. Let these fucking beautiful minds, let them flourish. Don't restrict them. When you restrict people in their natural incentives and their creativity, like I say, it's the unseen that we don't see. We see the Elon Musk, but that's just, like I say, that's one person. There could be literally 50, 100, maybe 1,000 of these people that could have benefited humanity. Who knows where we would be if it wasn't for the destructive nature of forced subjugation and collectivism. To me, that's the most important thing. Get away from using the big, gigantic gun in the room and start to respect and appreciate individuals and their creativity and what they bring to the table.
Well, decentralized systems, they're the future. If I may segue into blockchain just a little bit, the interesting thing that concerns established power, it's not just government power, it's also corporate power. And by corporate power, I mean power that is enabled by the government, monopolies that are enabled by the government through total union between the two spheres. Blockchain is a trustless system. And it's not even being adopted yet. But what it means is that you and I can engage in, say, a real estate transaction, and we no longer need a lawyer. I can engage in investment activity, and I no longer need an investment advisor. The fact it's trustless in that when you set up a contract between two individuals, that's all that exists. The rules of the contract are set, and nobody can alter them, and you don't need somebody to assure that the contract gets carried out. You can just do it. And that eliminates administrators. It eliminates the need for legalese. It eliminates so much. And that's why I think, it's one of the things that's right under the radar right now. Even when the mainstream media covers it, they only cover it as an alternative currency. They talk about, say, Bitcoin. It's an alternative currency. That is the least of the functions of blockchain. And that's why I think it's like we're climate change or whatever else. It's like, look over here, look at this thing, and keep focused on this thing so that we can keep you from looking over here at what's really important. And it's that's we're on the precipice of that, because even the internet that you and I use and that is valuable and that is free and wonderful, and they're trying to clamp it down. But again, one of the things that underlies that is the internet is actually, in many ways, very centralized. Whether it's Google or Facebook or the way that we do, our internet service providers, they have everything. That's another area where blockchain can decentralize the internet. You can have decentralized social media where nobody can censor you anymore. And we're starting to build it already. And it's, we are on the precipice of actually decentralizing so much, while at the same time living in a global community. It sounds like Orwellian doublespeak, but it's not. I mean, we can reach out and touch anybody. I got a letter this morning from the World Cindy Congress, I think is what it's called. And I was in Ottawa filming a documentary. I ran into these people. I did some coverage and whatever. And, months went by. They sent me a letter today, and they said, that was great. That was seen in Pakistan. It was seen in the U.S. It was seen in the EU. And it had an effect and it had an influence. And we wanted to thank you personally. And I don't say that to feather my hat. What I say it is that I can reach out now and affect something that's happening in Pakistan. I can help people there and volunteer to do so and actually have a measurable effect. That's the kind of power that we all have right now. And just to finish up, that's one excuse I'm sick and tired of hearing. It doesn't apply in the modern world anymore, and that is that we are powerless, we can't do anything, and we can't challenge these power structures. It's bullshit. It's total and utter bullshit. We are all enormously powerful. It's not just you, it's not just me, it's everyone has immense power. If you want to reach out and talk to, say, Jordan Peterson, you can do that. If you want to talk to a potential future prime minister, you can reach out and you can do that. It's all at your fingertips. I've done it time and time again, and I'm just some mug, man. Like I'm nobody, just like everybody else. It's all there for.
Yeah, and to expand on when you were talking about the blockchain, that's what I love about it too. And I've been trying to learn about this too. And the beautiful thing about the blockchain, like you say, is not just that you need this third-party intermediary. Because the beautiful thing about the blockchain is not just that if you and I transact, that you get a copy of this built-in ledger, because that's the underlying most important aspect of blockchain technology, is the built-in ledger system. So it's not just you or I when we do a transaction. It's not just that you or I get a receipt of that ledger, right? It's that everybody within that blockchain, within that whole, there could be millions of people. They all get the exact same ledger. So there's no way for anybody to trick each other. It can't be fudged. And like I say, when people talk about Bitcoin, listen, Bitcoin was just one of the very early platforms that adopted the blockchain technology. Now, the people that get into it early, and let me just tell you, I'll even give my own thing. I wish I had done this. I remember, because I was like learning about this thing very early on, but it was like 4 cents. But you know what? In a way, in some aspect, yeah, some people got rich on doing that. But you know what? That's not my whole thing. My thing, and what I love about the fact that there are industrial investors in blockchain and the miners. The miners are the ones that are putting the real skin in the game, because they have to build. Well, you got all these computers that you have to constantly, deconstruct and break through these massively, like, they're just really complex equations, and that's basically just like if you were mining gold or silver. There has to be productive effort put in before you can actually get anything back. So that's a beautiful natural incentive on its own. But blockchain is the important thing. Whether Bitcoin, I imagine the industrial investors, the ones that are wanting to make it seamless, the volatility is what happens with any new currency. That's just always, because nobody knows, because there are going to be those short sellers, right? The ones that just want to get in, capitalize, and sell off and make a profit. But if we all place our trust in the underlying technology, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's Ethereum, whether it's, I don't care what it ends up in the future. To me, it gives many competing models. So let's say tomorrow, just like if you were living in Venezuela, and this is what's happening in places like Venezuela, or some of these other emerging countries, or places where you have very, very corrupt governments, is at least it gives you the capacity to use another medium of exchange. And
well, yeah, I mean, there's how many billions of people on Earth? Sorry to cut you off, but how many billions of people on Earth who are never going to be serviced by the banks by design? They don't want these people having economic freedom, because you can't have the system set up the way it is if they ever get serviced. Blockchain instantaneously. There's I don't know how many billions of Nokia cell phones have been sold in the third world. Sometimes a village will have one and they share it as a service to connect themselves. Now all of a sudden they can raise funds.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's like I say, it's a beautiful thing, and like you don't have to place your faith in a particular, like I say, whether it's Bitcoin. Like I say, to me, it's once again another competitive modeling where it's early on in its creation, and this is actually what I love about like Mark. Yeah, exactly, and this is what you're going to see, and this is what happens. I've used examples before. If you were to sit down and play 10 board games, okay, you could create the board games up that look like the same, but everyone can come up with their own rules. Just by natural selection and natural incentive, you will eventually see over time people will congregate to whichever model seems to be most beneficial to everyone, where everybody can be held accountable. So I don't care. Like I say, to me, it doesn't matter whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's Ethereum, as long as there's competing models, because to me, that's the ultimate thing that holds each other to account. Government regulation, whenever there's been at any time, and this is what I always try to tell people when they talk about government regulation, is regulatory capture is something that all corporations, the cronies, they know listen, if there's going to be regulation, they want to get in on that and actually get to have get their lawyers involved in the particular wording, because if you're already sustained or have a big footprint in any social or economic activity, regulations are actually great, because then you can kind of prevent new entrants, new competition coming in and challenging your monopoly. Whereas with blockchain and people's ability to just, if you can just go out, just like with gold, you can't, when governments, when currencies were based on gold and silver as a medium of exchange, of a retention of value, even if government decided tomorrow that they wanted to pretend that they could, you can't print gold, for one. And another thing is, you don't have to necessarily go use the gold the government issues you. You can go out and mine your own goddamn gold. You have the capacity and the ability within yourself to at least affect what kind of currency it's going to, or what kind of value you're going to place on your productive labor and your capacities. Whereas with fiat currencies now that are completely removed from anything, well, I mean, the US, I guess, the gold is gone, but I guess when you call it the petrodollar, it's backed by commodity. But in reality, that's not even because the manipulation of that commodity. So in reality, currencies are now, the only thing that backs a currency now is the big gigantic gun, which is, I got a military and you better goddamn well use my, that's not a way to do things. If you allow people to use the competitive model, if you look throughout history, when there's been economic breakdowns in any society, people have always found a way, whether it was tulips, tally sticks, people will find a way to measure and use as a means to exchange or retain that value. And blockchain allows people to do so. Now, I've heard people that have suggested too, as far as blockchains, this is something I want to kind of elaborate on. People have heard things about like Gawk, what was it, MK or whatever it was, Mount Gox, right? Okay, listen, it's just like Mount Gox was basically like a bank. Well, if you left your money in an institution or somewhere else, then you took your chances. Whereas what you could have done instead, if you had Bitcoin, what you could have done instead is create your Bitcoin wallet, put it on a drive, a jump drive, a little hard drive, or a little, USB drive that you can take out and you can put it in your drawer. Well, it's as long as there's no internet connection, no Wi-Fi, they're not going to be able to steal any of your productive wealth or your income. And you'll be able to use that. Now, if you want to keep some of it on your smartphone to use as a medium of exchange, there's many ways to do it, but you can't just use the fact that people were foolish enough to fall into some scheme, and you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can't say that it was Bitcoin, the people that created Bitcoin, or the underlying premise, which is blockchain. You can't blame that. You can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Just be smart. Any investment you did, right? If I was the kind of person that was investing in gold on the markets, I'd want to make sure whoever I'm investing with, I can not just invest in paper gold. I want to make sure, can I get that gold in real? Can I grab some real gold, the tangible gold stuff? And if you tell me that, then okay, I might invest in that aspect. But once again, it's always market and competition oriented, where somebody's going to offer you something. And with competition, well, like I say, it doesn't matter any venture or any avenue you've ever undertaken a competitive modeling, it always raises and elevates each other. There's never been any venture that was competition based where it's gone the opposite way, where people have gotten progressive or productively worse.
Well, and you're totally correct when it comes to Mt. Gox, or one meme that is popular right now is the whole BitConnect fiasco that happened over the last couple of months, which was a Ponzi scheme. It collapsed, but Bitcoin itself was never hacked, and it was never compromised. It was people who left their Bitcoin on an exchange because they were trading, day trading, trying to make money. They left it on the exchange wasn't secure, and the exchange got hacked. The beautiful thing about blockchain is, right now, if you got money in the bank, and the central server of that bank, or the central servers of that bank get compromised or destroyed, say the building blows up, or something bad happens, or somebody, a whole pile of water gets poured on them, and they're compromised and destroyed, that's the end of the banking record. Whereas with the blockchain, as long as there's 2 or 3 computers anywhere in the world that have a copy of that chain, your wealth is preserved. And that's just how it works. And one of the ideal things about blockchain that I personally like is that your security is ultimately your responsibility. And since I'm a big fan of personal responsibility, that attracts me big time. Right. If your passwords are good and your credentials are good and you've protected that stuff, then it's yours. Nobody can get it as long as they don't have your credentials. It's up to you. Rather than you're trusting a third party to take care of your money for you, and worse yet with a bank, charging you for the privilege of hosting your money and allowing you to spend it. I mean, I pay something like 25 or 30 bucks a month in service charges sometimes, and it's like, why? That's my money, man. Why can't I just do that myself?
Yeah. And you're paying, the funny thing about, and a lot of people don't understand this thing, and it took me, well, whether you want to talk about a monetarist such as Milton Friedman, or if you go all the way back to Hayek or others, is what I think people don't understand, because I've talked to a lot of people out there, whether it's in, neighbors, co-workers, or others, they don't understand the aspects of inflation too, as far as, with fiat currencies. When they talk about inflation, what's happening today is, there is no natural market inflation that would be in excess, that would be expanding our GDP. So what central banks and central governments have done is they've created this little Ponzi scheme where they call it the 2% growth rate. But basically, if the people, right, so just like if you, and this goes back to Keynesianism, this is what blockchain prevents. Keynesianism suggests that if you are broke and you just can't afford, or maybe you just don't want to spend your money, maybe you want to save it, when you do that, and that's what's happened throughout history with under capitalist type systems, is when you want to restructure things or capitalize and save money so that you can use that productive income, that productive savings in the future, that does have an effect on slowing growth in the economy. But that's actually a good thing. But because of central planners, everything to them is always about inflating. But it's a false stimulus. It's a false economy. So what central banks and central planners do now, when they say they have a 2% growth target, basically, if the natural economy, you or I, if all of us spending in the economy only creates 0.1% of growth in the GDP, well, the central bank and the central government will expand on that to the tune of 1.9%. So they'll just print excess supplies of this fiat currency. And people might think that that's good, but in reality, no, because that's only going, the kind of people that get their money from the central banks are banksters, crony corporates, the government. So those are people that are getting access to that money, those funds, before there is an inflationary aspect to it. But
when they spend that money, it actually has greater value. But once it hits the economy and everybody else's pocket, that dollar's now worth.
Yeah, and this ties into the minimum wage thing. I talk about people all the time when they talk about, oh, we need to raise the minimum wage. It's like, it's not that you need to raise the minimum wage, folks. Let me tell you, when I was 15 and I started working at a lumberyard, and actually I was so young, you had to be 16, but because I quit school and I went to work, my parents had to sign a wager at my first employment, which was at a lumberyard. And I was making $4 an hour. Okay, this was in 1989 or 90. This was, like I say, this was no, that's late. That was in 86, sorry, because I was 16. But at $4.50 an hour, people say, oh, you could never live off that. Well, in reality, my spending power, my purchasing power at $4.50 or $4.50 was actually in excess of what I can today at, maybe in comparison, let's say $15 or $16 an hour, because the prices of everything, gas was 39 cents a liter. To rent a typical 2 or 3 bedroom apartment was $300, $350. If you take all this stuff into account, people keep thinking, oh, you got to keep chasing your tail like a fucking dog. You're just going to get dizzy constantly, because as the governments and the central banks inflate the currency needlessly, where there's not actual required demand, because if there's required demand, if there's actual economic growth, that expansion happens properly. But if it's just stimulated demand, right, government Keynesian stimulus, where the broken window fallacy enters in the equation, well, that's wasting, that's a squandering, and you get that inflationary aspect, like you say, where now everything costs more. So now we're chasing after our tail, which we're never going to catch, because the inflation will always and forever exceed our wages. And today we're seeing in 2018, and this is the crazy part, you could go back even 4 decades now, right? So even when I was just a twinkle in my mother's eye, and our wages, in correlation, in contrast to the cost of everything that our expenditures goes on, is actually stagnated and somewhat declined. And this is the part that disturbs me the most is, look at all the beautiful parts of the private sector of the market economies that has given us access to things at much cheaper price points. So even with all that innovation, even with all that amazing creativity, even with all of our trades and practices from all around the world and doing all that, we're still constantly have to have this inflationary aspect, because for some reason central banks, they took on the Keynesian model, and they did it for so long that even though monetarists like Milton Friedman and Hayek, even though some people that have kind of fought back against it and put forth more market economic fundamentals, because people have been reliant on that drug, that injection of that false stimulus, they don't want to put in the hard work and productive efforts to create wealth. Whereas now, like I say, with fiat currencies, why would I do that when I can just get governments, central banks, or the banksters, because that's another thing with fiat currencies. Now, it used to be, at least back in the day, you could only, if you had a deposit of, let's say, $1 million, well, you could only spend an extra $9 million. Even that wasn't proper. But now they've got it to the point where it's like 20 to 1. So there's so much inflationary aspect where they're taking, and that 2%, that's another thing I kind of get off on track, my mind, get off track of my thought process there. But that 2%, when they say 2% target inflation, if your wages aren't exceeding that, let's say your wages are only increasing by 0.5%. If there's a 2% increase in inflation year after year, that means that's 1.5% of stealth theft from your productive income. So every time you go out to buy something, that's 1.5% every year of your productive income that's being stolen by stealth mode. It's not a tax you can recognize. You can see it when you go to the store. And some of the taxes, well, value added or goods and service taxes, you can avoid them by just not consuming, right? But you can't escape inflation. And the part that disturbs me the most when you're talking about inflation is they've taken all the most important elements of inflation out of their CPI equation. So food, housing, right? Fucking energy, how can you take that? But they use the excuse, oh, it's so volatile. Well, I wonder why it's volatile. It shouldn't be volatile, because oil is it's cheaper to extract from the fucking ground nowadays with all the modern technology than it might have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's the fact that central planning and that one-size-fits-all approach and the fiat currencies, that's what's destroying everything. If we ever get to the point where we have competing models and competing currencies, then you'll see that the productivity, people will be shocked at how much. You don't even have to have inflationary aspects where you'll see actual real growth. The only difference is the real growth will come from those who are actually providing an actual tangible benefit for society. It won't be the false growth where you're just throwing money at people and hoping that it'll somehow create some economic growth.
Well, and I mean, it's a criminal cartel, is what it is. Except it's not criminal; it's legal. They've constructed a framework where these central planners and central bankers can essentially inflate the economy or deflate the economy at their whim. They never suffer, and we're talking generations upon generations into this game. We're talking 400 or 500 years. You can go back further if you want, but the power structures and the families themselves remain the same, and they have an absolute expectation, like the George Soroses of the world, that they are born to rule. It's almost like the divine right of kings, except it's been privatized. It's not coming out of kingship and governance now. It's coming out of central banks and those who benefit from their economic policies. And I think they deliberately avoid teaching in public school and in high schools actual basic fundamental economics. Maybe they give you a crash course in inflation, but they don't exactly instill in people what that actually means, because the vast majority of people that I know who are otherwise smart have no idea how they're being robbed through price points at the grocery store, at the bank, or through interest rates or whatever. Like they don't translate rising cost with the actual forces that are driving those costs up. If you actually had real money, I'm losing the term right now, but if you actually had proper money, if you had stable currency, those prices would fluctuate, but they would fluctuate a lot less because the currency itself is stable. It doesn't have a floating exchange rate or a floating value or a value that decreases or increases depending on interest rates. It's a unit of exchange, a stable unit of exchange. That's why when you see all these prices go up, it's just like, oh, people say it's getting so expensive to live, and it's like, no, it's not getting expensive to live. It's getting inflated because more and more of that purchasing power is being siphoned off through interest rates and through the banking system into their pockets, into the ruling elite's pockets. And believe me, there's a ruling elite, and they are accustomed to their rule, and they don't like competition.
Yeah, and when you say, I know you probably just, I've probably done the same thing myself, but just to clarify a little bit, when you say, as far as like they've kind of privatized, this is something that, especially when I started learning about Federal Reserves, central banks, and even the Bank for International Settlement stuff, when you're talking about central banks, even though even the Federal Reserve is considered somewhat a quasi, well, they suggest it's a private institution. So the whole pretense of that is to say, well, we're not beholden to any particular politician or party and mandate or edict, right? But in reality, that's kind of it's a linguistic term that is partially true. It's partially true because in reality, the very legislation that enacted a central bank in 1910, as you probably know, like Jekyll Island and stuff, or in Canada in 1917, where we had our own central bank. Well, no, actually 1933, 1917 was actually when the income tax, but I think it was 1933 in Canada. But these central banks, as much as they might try to put forth this pretense that they're private, their very existence it became established through an act of legislation. Just like corporations, people say, "Oh, well, I'm against corporations," but then they'll defend governments. Like, hello, the very concept of a legislation, post or prior to government legislation, you were just a business, you were just a company, you were just a store, right? It's the very act of that legislation that turns a business owner into a limited liability corporation, which in reality, there's not even a limited liability anymore. They basically removed all liability. The liability now is imposed on you and I, right? So we've seen perfect example of that was after the economic crash of 2008. What
a criminal act that was, that whole fiasco.
Unreal.
I mean, balls out in your face, and they got away with it.
Yeah,
they totally got away with it.
Yeah,
and there's no clearer example than 2008.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the thing that disturbs me most is this is one thing I've always noticed about the U.S., and that's why when Canadians or people from Britain, they look at the U.S., they're like, oh, they're looking how dysfunctional a family are. But you know what? The Americans, and because of their media and how they sensationalize things, but because they air their dirty laundry, right, is when you see a family that's airing their dirty laundry, it's like, oh, look at how terrible that looks. Whereas in Canada or the UK, we like to kind of hide our shit, right? we're fucking, trust me, we're just as bad, probably a lot worse actually, but we kind of have this pretense where, oh, let's put on this false front. Because what disturbed me the most, and I've downloaded, I uploaded it, I have it on my YouTube channel, I have redundancy, but I know many people I talk to today even, and this is 2018, but our banks, I don't know if you're probably familiar with this, but all of our banks, all 6 of Canada's big banks were bailed out to the tune of $114 billion. Some of them, 3 of our big banks, to the tune of 1.5 times of what, if you would bought every stock in the Royal Bank, you could have did that and had a half that amount left over, but that's how much, because they had to bail them out, then they had to recapitalize them. So 3 of their banks were already insolvent. So that tells you when they go around, the politicians or the pundit class goes around talking about how Canada has, oh, we have such a much more stable banking system economy. Bull fucking shit. You got money from the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the Bank of Canada, bailed them all out. The only difference is in Canada, they did that one-time reporting, but luckily people like myself, right, and people like yourself, there's a few of us out there that we fucking pay attention. So I made sure not only, and that's the beautiful thing about the internet, I have the ability, this is another thing, you could have never done this in the past. How could I have documented proof of this kind of shit? I couldn't have. I would have been just some idiot standing out on the corner and people say, look at this tinfoil hat motherfucker, right? But I have documented proof. It's there, folks. Our banks were all bailed out. The only thing is the Canadian media, they reported on it one time. And like I said, just do a search. Just do $114 billion and then put bank bail-ins. And you'll see it.
We have some of the worst media in the world in this country.
Terrible.
We also have a collective responsibility, I think, because you can't, it's always tempting to blame government, blame media for inaccurate reporting, and that's totally true. The media is god-awful in this country across the board. I don't care what you look at, it's terrible. Mm-hmm. But there's also an apathy. There's absolutely a culture of sleepiness in this country. It's almost like as long as the lights keep turning on and the car keeps starting, we don't have to pay attention to what's actually going on in our names. And it's almost it's old, it's archaic, it's almost old-fashioned that we don't ask questions, we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about religion. But we're changing that. I think we're changing that. I think we're a little bit behind the United States we're way behind the United States when it comes to the state of alternative media, because the alternative media is becoming the new media. But I think that with the internet, we are going to dethrone these media companies that don't do news. They don't cover anything of value. They either make excuses for the Prime Minister, or they just exclude any relevant information when it comes to what's actually happening, like bank bailouts, like where the money's going. It's it's something that all Canadians, which you and I are doing, and every day we strive to do better, but Canadians themselves need to really awaken to their power to actually get involved in politics, create change, because right now there's no excuse anymore. Anybody that says, oh, I don't have time, bullshit. You're choosing how to allocate your time differently. You need to take a little bit of time and look at it. Everybody's got 20 or 30 minutes to empower alternative media or alternative voices that are actually covering this stuff. And I honestly believe they will. But that's the point that's got to be hammered home. Every single person is important and powerful and connected to the mains. We've all got our hands right on the mains of society. We're all powerful.
Oh man, Frank, when you were saying that, I was just like, preach it, my brother. No, but I'm serious. But I love when you say it, because that's something we have to point out first and foremost. Even like you say, we can keep pointing the fingers constantly at these corrupt motherfuckers, but it's that apathy and that complacency, which is what I do. And I'll admit I've caused some hardships in some of my own personal relationships, but you know what? The truth and the long-term consequence of all this shit matters more to me than just appeasing everyone. I did that when I was younger, and I realize even today, to this day, hey, I could go back to being that guy that was just, hey, let's just constantly be complacent with everything and go along, get along with everybody. And look, you can be the most popular fucking person in the world, but I don't care anymore. Listen, I enjoyed that when I was younger. I'm at the point in my life now, I don't give a fuck if I don't care if there's one person that likes what I got to say or a million people. I'm just going to speak truth to reason, because I think that's the only thing that can break people out of that mindset, that complacency, that apathy. It's those cold hard truths. And in reality, it's not just a hypothetical, it's a reality, because I've affected myself in that way. The only time I've ever grown or learned is when I've challenged my preconceived notions, is when I've challenged myself. And I've had to go through myself. That's people, when they get all upset about it, it's like, I love to tell them, listen, I've been exactly where you are. I was ignorant in many areas at many times in my life in the past. And it was hard to, it was hard to go through that change. It's rough, because when you're learning something new, it's like, oh damn, it's breaking all my old paradigms. But my God, I'm thankful that has happened.
Well, and chances are you're not done. I know I'm not done. And that's the thing that people need to understand. You know, like I've got friends who are right into Jordan Peterson. Very valuable, but don't put him on a pedestal. Don't put Bennett Hunter on a pedestal.
Exactly.
Don't put Frank Vaughn on a pedestal. We're here trying to learn and educate and do things, but my God, we're not above being challenged, and we're not above growth. That's the key. If you think you're done, or you think you know everything, or you have all the friggin' answers, that's the exact moment you need to stop talking and start listening. Because, you know, as much as we are all powerful, and we are, in order to maintain that power and that place of advantage and that place of power, is we have to realize our own imperfection.
You're right.
And keep people off of pedestals. Learn from them, admire them, do whatever you want, but just, it's, you know, no single person has all the answers. And if you think you do, you're part of the problem.
Yeah, it's got to be about the ideas. It's got to be about the philosophy. It's got to, like, yes, the minute you place that into any particular person's hand, once again, you just created a cult-like personality. And then those people have the ability and the capacity, especially if they're good with linguistics, right? I mean, think of your typical snake oil salesman. These are the people that congregate to the halls of, you know, academia now and in government, is because they realize that they can use these platforms and these institutions to affect the human psychology in a way that benefits them the most. Whereas I don't want, like I say, I tell people all the time, and I always, anything I discuss, especially if I'm covering a particular topic or subject, I always tell people, it's almost like I almost should have a disclaimer at the bottom of my video. I'm just giving you an opinion. It's a fairly well-informed opinion, because I'm the kind of person that, just like whether I'm building engines or doing anything else, or in my construction trades in the past, I want to make sure I'm very proficient at what I do. I'm just that kind of person. But even though I'm good at what I do, don't take my word for it, because like I say, the minute you get into that mentality, like you said, Frank, where it's that one size fit all, where it all got to be like sheep following the one shepherd. Well, I mean, that you don't, unless you have any, well, there's no such thing as that perfect shepherd. That shepherd's going to be fallible too. So just be willing to allow alternative opinions and views into your mind. Accept the fact that you're going to have some cognitive dissonance. You're going to have some disturbing aspects. You're going to be presented with stuff. Just like I come from a religious family, I still have a spiritual side to me. I still like to have this concept of this thing called God. Like I say, it doesn't have to be what a lot of people would suggest, but it doesn't mean, my thing is, though, I am at least right. And to me, what I've learned as an adult is, yeah, that's me. And it's not that I would ever suggest, just like with my kids, my wife's an atheist. I was raised in a religious family. Me and my wife never imposed either one. You don't have to be an atheist. You don't have to be, here's what people from religious sects talk about. Here's some of the good things from it. Here's aspects of what the atheist thinks about. Here's some positive. Here's the negative. And just use your mind. And like I said, I mean, it's just an animal example, but both of my sons that are now in their 20s have turned out to be some of the most well-adjusted, amazing, intellectually astute, and creative. I'm more than proud of just the sheer fact, because I recognize that just like with society, just like government society, is, to me, it's just shrink it down in size and scope to your family setting, is if you're a good parent, just like if you're a good someone that's part of government, is to allow many alternative opinions to propagate, and just give people the ability, the formulation, right, to tell them that you have to take certain things with a grain of salt. Not everything's going to be 100% truthful, but at least work through. To me, the most important thing is, no matter what you learn, no matter if you're into politics, philosophy, business, or social aspects of humanity, is what is moral. Start from the moral basis first, because morality, without morality, well, then we're just going back to, without morality, we're just back to the state of nature. And the funny thing I always tell people that usually predominantly come from the left side of the political spectrum, if you want things to go back to the natural state of nature, well, let me tell you, those of you that have always seek to use the gun in the room as a means to an end, well, that's because you're weaker than a lot of people that aren't.
You'll be awfully naked in the jungle.
Perfectly said, Frank. So, it's those of us, actually, the crazy thing that I see is a lot of us people that are either identify as libertarian or independent or critical thinkers or whatever. Those are actually usually the people that could use their power, stature, strength, their natural capabilities against other people. The fact that we're the ones that are willing to say we don't want to use,
we're restrained.
Right. I'm willing to completely restrain myself and function inside. I want to play a game with my fellow human beings, but I'm willing to function that we all have to play by the same rules. Right? That's my baseline premise, is we all have to function from the same rules, and the only way anyone would ever agree to a set standard or set rules is if everyone starts out on an even playing field. Nobody would ever agree to enter into a game where you're going to be at a disadvantage to everyone else. Nobody would choose to voluntarily into that. So like I say, you got to start, whether it's your social development, your economic mentality, anything that you conceptualize or conceive of, it has to start from a moral foundation. Then you expand that out to however you want to do it, but as long as the moral foundation is there, and as long as you allow for dissenting voices, opinions, then like I say, I mean, thank God people like Galileo or Newton, even back in their day, could you imagine being Galileo back in the day, saying, hey, by the way, we're not the center of the universe, or Newton as such, right? It's like you were, oh, it's a heretic. You probably look like, oh, that's a weird fucking dude, but he proved that in the end he was correct. So never sacrifice the individual for some concept of a greater good or collective, because that individual might be that one person that is trying to help lead you to something that's outside of your natural paradigms or your preconceived notions. So allow, like I say, individual ideas, allow individualism to flourish, and that's what's always benefited all of humanity properly, without using force or coercion.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, it's that sort of patience and that sort of open-mindedness. Like, I actually, I'm scared to admit this because maybe you won't ever talk to me again, but I have a pair of friends that they're both communists. They love Karl Marx. Right. And I talk to them, I talk to them on a regular basis. They've unfriended me a couple times and stopped talking to me a couple times, but they always come back. Yep. And I where I stand on that. I think it's absolutely absurd and wrong. And they're anti-gun, but they love the gun in the room. They love government guns because they want to impose their will on everybody else. Mm-hmm. But I continue to have that conversation, even though I am totally morally juxtaposed to their opinions and their beliefs. I'll still entertain them and talk to them. I'll still break bread with them every now and again, because we have to demonstrate that which we want to see in the world through our own actions. We have to, if I want, if I'm upset that I go to a rally in Ottawa or something, and there's Antifa and they're blowing their little rape whistles and they're getting all in your face and whatever, and they're telling you to go fuck yourself and everything else, if I bring it back to them on that same level, I'm not much better. So when I do that sort of work, I go to them and I try to point out, it's like, you guys you're supposed to be gathered here in the name of peace and love and prosperity, and you're trying to shut me down and kill me. If you could, you would. If you could, you would. You would have me arrested and thrown in a gulag. That's not peace and love. That's not all these good feelings that on your little placards there. You're talking about equality and everything else, and you're screaming at me. And I try to point that out as calmly as I can. And the amazing thing is that sometimes you can have a profound influence on somebody to actually start doing that with their own opponents, and to start changing their mind. And we got to do that.
Well, Well, exactly. And my freedom and my security is wholly reliant on me giving other people their freedoms and their security. So that's that reciprocal effect that we can't ever escape. So like you, I always tell people that are socialists or communists in nature, because I understand that some of them are just plain malevolent. But just like some of the libertarian utopians, communists, some of the pretenses and the premise, if you read even like Das Kapital or the communists, listen, there's some pretenses where you can see how, and there's a reason why it became popular, right? So people have this concept. To me, it's just a matter of how you get to that point. So they've got the wrong way to implement their utopia, right? But I'm more than willing, like I've said in the past, whether, I don't care if it's First Nations people or just plain communists or socialists, if you want to set up some system or a commune type setting where everybody sacrifices themselves for some concept of the greater good, then by all means do so. And if you enter into that relationship voluntarily, then you're ultimately going to be not just responsible for your own participation, but the consequences and the result of that too. So as long as you're willing to have that personal accountability and that personal responsibility and not impose it on me, I don't give a shit. I don't give a fuck if people want to set up all kinds of communes, because hey, maybe there are, I don't even doubt for a minute, there are probably a small section of our society that might very well function fine under that. And why shouldn't they have that afforded to them? I have no problem with people that want to do that. I have no problem whatsoever. Just like just quick story, when I used to drive cement truck, very few people, and it's an unfortunate thing where I grew up in New Brunswick, there is some racism towards the First Nation people. I hearken it back to just ignorance and bullshit, but people have preconceived notions. So a lot of these guys that drove cement mixers wouldn't deliver to the First Nation communities. I was like, I don't give a fuck. Give it to me. I'll take them. I don't give. And I got along with most of them. When we get into conversations, I did recognize that this is probably some of the things that keeps your communities downtrodden, some of the way you think. But hey, I'm not going to tell you how to think. And if that's what you want to do, all I would say is I might offer them maybe another alternative that I might think might benefit them more. But if you want to continue functioning in that kind of collective mindset, by all means do so. The only thing is, you don't get to forcefully take from me. And I don't want to use myself or my children or any other Canadian as sacrificial lambs for some pretense that someone in the past might have done some immoral act. And that's another thing when you're talking about First Nations people. I'm probably going to go off a little bit of tangent here, but I'll keep it short. But one thing I can't stand is when they talk about this whole thing is that we owe these people. Listen, like I said, I'll help anybody out voluntarily, and I've gotten along with people. I don't care, every kind of skin color, and I know this, and I can say this, and know that I'm not going to get backlash because I've lived this. This is how I've always been. I just don't give a shit about your skin color, your race, or any of that shit. But if it wasn't for the fact that they use that pretense to forcefully take from productive members in Canadian society that haven't, I didn't cause any Aboriginal people any harm, nor do I believe in the concept that any of these tribes in the past, like North America, if people don't understand geography, that's a big motherfucking continent here, okay, peeps? Nobody could ever suggest to me, and even in school I was taught this stuff, but I rejected as an adult, is nobody has any legitimate claim to the entire continent of North America. Neither does the English government, right? Neither does the Canadian government. Neither does the American government. Politicians, central planners, the authoritarians, they don't get to lay stake or claim to an entire continent. That's the beautiful thing about property rights and personal freedoms, is people have the right, just like in any aspect of any, like whether you're a tree or an animal, we all have to, if we're alive on this planet, we have to have some little section that we get to live, right? That's how we thrive and survive. So I don't fall for the bullshit pretense that I'm supposed to be indebted or guilty for some pretense that some bad actors caused a lot of pain and hardship to some other bad actors, tribal leaders. I don't doubt there was some white people that did some really terrible thing to Aboriginal people hundreds of years ago. But don't think that that wasn't a reciprocal thing. There was some bad acting from both sides, right? And
this is the thing. This is the nuance, right? And this is the nuance that's always missing in the conversation. When the first Europeans actually came to North America and South America, they were slaughtered. They never won a battle. One of the misconceptions is that Pizarro and Cortez showed up and they just had an easy time. They didn't. They got slaughtered. They got massacred. But what happened is they brought the pox. and the pox killed 95% of the indigenous population. So that when settlers started arriving en masse, what they found was we have this concept of natives running around in the trees. That's not how it worked. They had cleared land. They were growing crops. They had towns. They had cities that were up to 50,000 people gathered in these cities. They got wiped out. So when the original Europeans, for the first 100 years they were showing up, they found this empty place where the land was already cleared. And, you know, it was that blew my mind when I actually learned how that actually happened. So I mean, that idea of and I mean, it did happen, don't get me wrong, especially in the United States. There was a period in the 18th century where Indians were massacred and there were horrible things done. There's no doubt about that. And in Canada, the residential schools, all that sort of stuff, horrible things done. I've got native blood in my veins, so I mean, people can't even really accuse me of being racist against natives. I mean, I guess they can. But the point I'm trying to make is concurrent with your point, is that if you talk to somebody that thinks there's an original restitution claim against those people who are alive today, people who never did any harm to those communities right now today, if you talk to those people about the religious concept of original sin, they'll reject it out of hand because it comes from religion, yet they're employing original sin on the people who are alive today. Any solution that we can come up with that actually lays this thing to rest cannot be based on saddling anybody in a society with the sins and guilt of something they never completed. It doesn't mean that we can't come up with some sort of framework or agreement that actually focuses on from today forward, but we can't constantly be going back 150 years and saying people alive today owe for it, because unless you subscribe to original sin, and I don't, I think it's bullshit that somebody, you know, my forefathers and the stupid decisions they made, you know, I bear that burden today. Come on, I've got my own mistakes I need to deal with. You know,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I've got enough.
Yeah.
So, you know, there is something there, and I mean, the historical context of all of it has been, as far as I'm concerned, completely lost. This idea, like you know, it's not to say that land theft didn't happen. I'm not saying that. But when you actually examine the history, the first settlers didn't steal anything because all the people who were on that land were dead already. And they didn't, in many cases, they were dead. It's just how it was. And they didn't, it wasn't at the hands of you know, white axes. It was at the hands of a disease that, I guess you could say that was our responsibility too. But it was, you know, there's this gap in historical knowledge, and people don't like it when you bring up that particular fact.
Yeah.
Because it muddies the water.
Yeah. Well, that whole concept of collective guilt, that's the thing that I reject outright. And that's why I love the beautiful aspect of the philosophy of liberty and individualism is we deal with each other on an individual basis. So you might have a grievance or disdain or loathing for certain people and certain actors throughout history, which I'll stand in solidarity with you and go against those kinds of people, right? Because I am, you know, I'm the kind of person that I believe in the live, let live mentality, the non-aggression principle. I just, you know, dealing with each other with voluntary exchange and interaction socially or economically. So if someone did someone wrong in the past, fine, but I am not responsible for that. And the thing that kind of is a double down on people such as myself, and I'm not trying to claim any victimhood myself or victim mentality because this is something I've rejected completely. But I mean, I am of Irish and Scottish descent, and if you know the history of the Irish people predominantly, my God, we were constantly trying to be enslaved by whether it was the British or the Romans. I mean, we were, but hey, listen, I don't use the fact that maybe some of my ancestors might have been enslaved, and even when they were brought to, you know, the New World, like in the United States and Canada, blacks were nearly, until the Irish were the dominant slave trade for the most part, or indentured servants, right, that come from Europe. There was millions or tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Irish that came as indentured servitude under the indentured servitude model or serfdom, that they had to work for years of their life to pay off the fact that they got to come to a free place because they were trying to escape the oppressive nature of the monarchs in old world Europe. Once again, though, the beautiful thing about the Irish people, and they were, you know, very, well, they were less educated than a lot of their English and Scottish counterparts. But rather than playing the victim mentality, the victim culture, what I love about a lot of the Irish people, and this is, once again, I'm kind of saying it in a collective way, so there are exceptions to the norm, and this is just a generalized statement, but it was that old, just like when I raised my kid, it was, I'm going to teach you, you know, the proper ways, and you're not going to grow up as a victim, but you're going to do better and go forward, and that's how you're going to become more principled, more personally responsible and accountable than rather than playing the victim. Whereas I've noticed with a lot of other special interest groups, you don't hear no lobbying for Irish or reparation or anything for what has happened in the past. But some of these other groups like First Nations or black people, and I've known a lot of black people and First Nation people too, and they reject this. It's like, wait a minute, stop talking about us as these helpless fucking victims, because you're destroying the psychology of the people in my community by telling them that they're constantly just a bunch of victims. If you tell people,
I was talking to a gay guy. I don't know when it was months ago, and he said something along the lines of, "Stop calling me a gay man. I'm just a man.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
just a man."
Yeah,
like I'm sick of being like it's like this. The same people who are complaining about all these identities and how there are no identities want to subdivide everybody into differing identities.
right.
Like it's pretty scary stuff. It's insane, really, is what it is.
It is. And you know what? Like Ayn Rand said, like I say, she was a philosophical genius as far as I'm concerned of the early 20th century. But like she said, when people talk about they care about minorities and minority rights, well, let me tell you, the individual is the smallest minority on the planet, right? And if you really care about minorities and their rights and their freedoms, then you have to deal with each other on an individual basis. And I've not just in the political realm, and not just deal with marketing or anything, just in my own personal life, and I'm pretty sure anyone watching this video will understand instinctively as well, is you know yourself. If you deal with an individual just as an individual and how they treat you, you know, the whole golden rule, 99.9% of the time in your life, you're going to recognize that most people, they might be different in some ways, in some aspects than you, but if you treat people decent, most of the time, now there's always going to be that small exception that people that are evil or are criminal in nature, but no mandates, no government legislation, nothing is going to prevent those small segment of society from being bad actors or evil. So the best way for us to start out on any, you know, if you're going to put your best foot forward, then you deal with each individual that you ever encounter as someone that you treat me the way I treat you, and we'll be able to walk away from any of our social or economic transactions where we both feel like we've won. We feel like we've both benefited each other, and there is no malice. There's no contempt. There's no envy. There's no, you know, this thing where, oh, this person has used force against me, this resentment, that's what I see today is what socialism and communism and forced collectivism, subjugation is. It's all about envy and resentment. And
oh yeah, it's pure envy and jealousy. Yeah, for sure.
And that's a terrible way, because not only really it's not about building people up, envy and resentment is about tearing people down. And just
taking what they have because you don't have it.
Right, so that'd be like me going out, and I'm using a real old example because Usain Bolt. I was going to say Ben Johnson, old example, but I'll never beat Usain Bolt in a race, nor would I ever want to go out and trip him as he's run. Now, if I was the running kind of person, I would want to seek out who is really good at that particular sport. Well, Usain Bolt. Okay, maybe I want to try to emulate them. That's the thing. That's the beautiful thing about not having envy or disdain or loathing people that are better than you is rather than hate them for them being more successful than me, I want to emulate, I want to learn from them. And if I can't ever get to that point, I may never get to that point, well, I can always at least strive to be as best as I can be. And that's a goal, and that's something that gives you real meaning in your life, because happiness is important, but meaning, just like Jordan Peterson says, happiness and meaning, they have to go hand in hand, because you'll never get your happiness without having meaning, right?
Perfect.
Well, Frank, I got to say, man, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time out today to do so. And I'm always looking for all the time. So if you know anyone else, and you can mention to me as well, anybody out there, if you're Canadian predominantly, I care about people from all over the world and all over, not just the Western world, anywhere. But predominantly, I am a Canadian. Frank's a Canadian. So, you know, we care. We prioritize what's going on in our own particular backyard. So I want to reach out to my fellow Canadians. This is the kind of stuff we got to start talking about, folks. We got to hammer out ideas, right? We can't just make things about personalities or politics, you know, political parties, tribe A versus tribe B. We got to start, you know, just let's reiterate and refocus our attention, kind of like what the folks did back in the 18th and 19th century, as far as, you know, bringing about the Enlightenment era. We live in the information age. We live in the age of information of the internet. So we got, yeah, go ahead, Frank.
We're going to put this out there for the world to rip apart. That is something people need to do, because that's the nature of the argument, as Stefan Molyneux would say, and the conversation is fundamental to the survival of our little civilization. So, like, I applaud you for what you do, and likewise, you know, if there's people who want to join in a conversation like this, all the power. We should be doing that.
On Frank, and like you, that's the thing. Like I've learned a lot of things. I've grown and I've developed in many areas, so many aspects of my life where I've had to go through those disturbing changes. When you're breaking through your preconceived notions, they can be hard at times. But it's what has helped me grow and help develop my mind. And I'm humble enough to accept the fact that even though I have a fairly in-depth knowledge in many areas and topics, I also am willing to accept that I don't know it all. I want other people. Like I say, to me, and that's I guess that goes back to my competition modeling. I kind of inherited this from my dad. Racing has kind of always been my heritage, but it's kind of helped expand in not just philosophical or political or social or economic things. Is competition is about a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of things, and ultimately they all work so that, a perfect example, like if you're racing cars. There's been people that have raced Ford, Chevs, Dodge, Toyotas, but in the end, all racers have benefited from hearing and learning and implementing and adopting the practices, the best trade practices of others, even their competitors. So I'm all about competition. I'm all about, tell me what you got to say. I don't care if you're a socialist, a communist, capitalist. I don't care if you want to go at things from the macro aspect as far as philosophy, or if you just want to talk about politics, or even if you're a single issue person. Talking about these things is what actually helps educate and enlighten people. And it's not just me and Frank, like us having this exchange that learns. It's anyone else that's willing to pay attention to what we got to say. We all help each other out by having these kinds of exchanges, these kinds of conversation, these kinds of even people, like I say, that I encounter, even a debate, even when I'm talking to people that I have a lot of disagreements with. Ultimately, at the end of that conversation, I've probably taken an extra piece of information that I didn't have prior, and I've benefited in some way, and I'm sure they have as well. So, like I say, and like Frank's saying, we're out here, folks. We're trying our best. We're just grassroots. We're just, like I say, we're not even into the politics. We're just people that care tremendously about not just ourselves, our inner circle, our family, our loved ones, but we care about our locality, our province, and ultimately our country, and ultimately the world. But we care about what goes on, because if we got to function in this world, well, like I said in the past, prior in the part of this conversation, is my freedoms and my liberty requires that I'm willing to do those and give those to others. So if you have anything to say, if you want to have a conversation with me or Frank, both of us are willing to do so. Well, I won't speak for Frank.
I am.
Have a conversation.
Right there, man.
Right on. So I'm going to tie this video up. Thanks again, Frank, for having this conversation. Once again, folks, go visit frankvaughn.ca. You can find him on Facebook, and you have a YouTube channel too, don't you, Frank?
Yep. It's Frank Vaughn on YouTube. You'll find me if you put that name in, Frank Vaughn Podcast or whatever.
Right on. And like I say, Frank's been out there. That's why I got to know Frank, is because I seen him out there. He's just another awesome guy standing up for freedom and liberty. And what more can you ask from that? It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.